It was supposed to be just another weekend getaway, a chance for a group of friends to break free from the grind of their city lives. They were all looking for something different, a break from the noise, the chaos, and the stress that came with living in a bustling urban environment. When one of them suggested a weekend trip to Kansas, it seemed like a perfect idea. Simple, quiet, and away from it all. They had heard the stories, of course. The legends about the old abandoned farm fields. The ones where strange things had happened. But to them, it was just one of those spooky tales that people told around campfires. Something to laugh about. Something that would add a bit of thrill to their trip. They weren't worried. They were just excited to get away. But as soon as they arrived, something felt off. The first thing that hit them was the air. It wasn't the fresh, earthy smell of a country getaway. No, this was different. There was a sharpness to it, a strange tang that made them all wrinkle their noses in discomfort. The scent was earthy, yes, but underneath it was something heavier, something more rancid, like something had been buried beneath the soil for far too long. The fields stretched out in front of them, wide and empty, as far as the eye could see. There was no sound, except for the occasional rustle of wind through the dry grass, and the way the land seemed to stretch on forever felt oppressive, as if the earth was swallowing them whole. The horizon was heavy, dark, and empty, like an ocean of land with no escape. The fields were so vast, they looked almost unnatural. The grass was dry, a sickly yellow that had long since lost its green vibrancy. They hadn't seen a single sign of life since they turned off the highway. No birds, no animals, not even the chirp of insects. Just endless stretches of dirt and rotting remnants of old farmhouses, their wooden walls caving in and sagging under years of neglect. Some of the houses were little more than skeletal frames now, hunched and broken like abandoned graves. There was a quiet here, a heavy silence that seemed to settle in the air and stick to the skin. It was the kind of silence that made you wonder if something was wrong, if something was watching you, waiting for you to notice. And then there was the sky. It was the color that struck them first. The sky above wasn't blue like they had expected. It was an unsettling shade of red, almost like the clouds themselves were burning from the inside. As the sun dipped lower toward the horizon, the red hue deepened, staining the sky with the blood-like color that seemed to hang over the land like a warning. They all noticed it, but no one said anything at first. It felt too unnatural. As the sun set, casting long, sharp shadows over the desolate landscape, the group started to set up camp near one of the old barns that still stood crookedly on the edge of the fields. It was a rustic barn, battered and worn, its once white paint peeling and chipped, revealing the old wood beneath. There was something oddly beautiful about it, in a decaying sort of way. Despite its condition, it was still a place of refuge, offering shelter from the oppressive feeling that was slowly creeping over the group. They set up their tents, started a fire, and tried to shake off the unease that had settled in their stomachs. The night began to fall quickly, the temperature dropping as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. A chill swept through the air, and the wind picked up, whistling through the fields, causing the dry grass to sway and rustle. The fire crackled, its warm light flickering against the growing darkness. But even as they gathered around it, joking and laughing to lift their spirits, they couldn't quite shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the strange air or the ominous sky. It was something else, something intangible. They could feel it in their bones. The wind carried whispers, too faint to understand but loud enough to be noticed. Sometimes it was like a soft murmur, like the land itself was speaking. The group tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the wind, to the isolation of the place. But deep down, they couldn't deny it. The land was too quiet, too still. There was no sound of animals, no rustling of leaves in the trees, just an unsettling calm. As the night stretched on, the group sat around the campfire, their voices low and their laughter forced. The flames danced and flickered, casting eerie shadows across their faces. They tried to ignore the rising sense of dread, but it was getting harder. Something about this place, this night, felt wrong. Then it came. At first, it was barely audible. A faint rustling sound coming from the farthest edge of the field. It wasn't the wind, not this time. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Something moving through the dry grass. Something larger than the usual nocturnal creatures that roamed these fields. They all stopped talking, their eyes scanning the darkness. But no one said anything. Dave, always the skeptic and the one who loved to make light of every situation, was the first to break the silence. Probably just a raccoon or something, he said with a grin, trying to sound dismissive. Or maybe a deer. It's Kansas, after all. The others nodded, but deep down, they all felt it. It didn't sound like an animal. It didn't sound like anything they had heard before. A wind picked up again, swirling around them, tugging at the fire. The flames flickered wildly, casting large, twisting shadows over the ground. The rustling from the field grew louder, closer now, but it wasn't just a noise anymore. It was a presence, a feeling that crawled up the back of their necks and made the hair stand on end. The group shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting nervously in the direction of the sound. Suddenly, the fire flickered one last time, and the shadow appeared. It was tall, much taller than any man, and its outline was distorted in a way that made it seem unnatural. It moved through the field with a fluidity that was almost too smooth, too calculated. It wasn't just the shape of a person, it was something more, something larger, something that felt wrong. They all froze, their hearts hammering in their chests. The figure stood motionless at the edge of the field, just beyond the reach of the firelight. For a long moment, it didn't move. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, It vanished into the darkness. No one spoke at first. The silence was thick and heavy, pressing in on them from all sides. They could all feel it, an unspoken tension that lingered in the air. The laughter from before had vanished, replaced by an eerie quiet that settled like dust over everything. "What the hell was that?" someone whispered, breaking the silence. But no one had an answer. The rustling in the field had stopped. The wind, too, had fallen silent. Only the crackling of the fire remained, but even that felt like an intrusion in the stillness. No one slept that night. The fire kept them awake, its light flickering against the growing darkness, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Something was out there, in the fields, watching them, waiting. As the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, the group packed up quickly, eager to leave the eerie place behind. But even as they drove away, the feeling of being watched didn't leave them. The fields stretched out behind them, empty and silent. But somewhere out there, something still lingered. The blood-red sky was gone, but the terror that had been awakened in those fields would never leave them. The legend had never truly died. It was only waiting for the right moment to return, and it was waiting for them. And next morning, the group felt the weight of what had happened the night before, still hanging heavily in the air. They couldn't shake the image of that tall, shadowy figure moving across the fields, nor the strange rustling they had heard before it appeared. It felt like something had been awakened in the dead of night, and now they were just part of a larger story they didn't understand. They decided to go into town and try to get more information. They thought it would be easy. A quick stop at the local diner or gas station. Maybe ask a few questions, and then they could brush it off as just an old ghost story. But when they got to town, they found something much darker waiting for them. Mill Creek was a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone's business. The buildings were old and worn, with faded signs hanging above the shops. The streets were narrow, with cracks in the pavement that had been there for years. As they walked through the town, they couldn't shake the feeling that the place was stuck in time, frozen in the past. The locals moved slowly, keeping to themselves, and their eyes followed the group as they passed. As if they knew something they didn't. They stopped at the local gas station, hoping to get some information from the old man behind the counter. He was bent over a newspaper, barely glancing up when they walked in. His face was wrinkled with age, and his hands trembled slightly as he folded the paper. "You kids came from the old fields, huh?" he said suddenly, his voice sharp and raspy, as though he had been waiting for them to ask. The way he said it made the group freeze in place. It was like he had known they would come. The man didn't look up from his work, but his tone was enough to make the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. "You shouldn't be out there," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "The land, it's cursed. Bad things happened there a long time ago." The group exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard rumors, of course, but they hadn't expected to hear something like this from a local. They pressed him for more details, but the man only shook his head, his expression hard. "It's best you leave it alone. People who stay out there, they don't come back. I don't talk about it," he muttered, almost to himself. "Just don't trust the blood-red sky. It's a sign." A man's words hung in the air like a dark warning. The group stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The mention of the blood-red sky struck a chord with them. They had all noticed the strange hue to the sky the night before, but they hadn't paid much attention to it at the time. Now, the words seemed to carry a weight they couldn't ignore. They pressed him further, asking if he could tell them more about the curse. But the old man only muttered something about how it wasn't for outsiders to understand, and turned back to his work, clearly done with the conversation. They left the gas station, a sense of unease gnawing at them, but they were determined to find out more. The library was their next stop. It was a small, dusty building at the end of Main Street, its windows dim with age. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old books and mildew. A middle-aged woman stood behind the counter, her eyes flicking up as they entered. She didn't smile, just nodded at them, as if she already knew what they were looking for. They asked her if she had any books about Mill Creek's history, particularly anything to do with the old farm fields. The woman's eyes narrowed for a moment, as though weighing whether or not she should help them. But eventually, she nodded and led them to the back of the library, where the history books were kept. She pulled a thick, worn book from the shelf and handed it to them without a word. The book was old, its pages yellowed and fragile, the cover cracked and faded. It was a local history of Mill Creek, chronicling the rise and fall of the town. They opened it cautiously, and as they flipped through the pages, they came across a section about the old farm fields, the very ones they had camped near the night before. The story was brief but chilling. The fields had once been home to prosperous families who had grown crops and raised cattle. The land was fertile and the farmhouses were full of life. But that all changed when a strange illness swept through the town. Crops began to wither. Cattle mysteriously vanished. And one by one, the families living on the land disappeared. No one knew what happened to them. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty homes and empty fields. The land was abandoned, and the town moved on. But the book didn't end there. It spoke of something darker, of strange symbols that had been found carved into the barn walls, symbols that the locals believed were tied to an old cult that had once lived in the area. The cult was said to have practiced dark rituals, invoking spirits to control the land. The red sky that had appeared before the curse took hold was said to be a sign, a warning from the spirits themselves. The legend went on to say that anyone who stayed on the land after sunset would be trapped. Their souls would become bound to the fields, forever wandering the earth as spirits. The curse, it seemed, was eternal. The more they read, the more the hair on the back of their necks stood up. The details matched perfectly with the eerie feeling they had experienced the night before. The rustling in the field, the shadowy figure that had appeared, everything seemed connected. It was as if the legend had been waiting for them all along. They were no longer just tourists in an old town. They were part of something much darker, something they couldn't escape. As they finished the chapter, the room grew colder. The chill in the air seemed to seep into their bones. The oppressive feeling of the land, of the curse that had been waiting, grew stronger. They glanced at each other, their faces pale, their minds racing. They had come here looking for adventure, but now they realized they had stepped into a nightmare. They looked back at the librarian, who was watching them with a knowing expression. She didn't say anything, but it was clear she had seen this reaction before. She had seen people come and go, all with the same curiosity, all with the same fate. The group left the library in silence, the weight of the story pressing down on them. They had come looking for a thrill, but what they found was far more terrifying than they could have imagined. The Bloodred Sky was not just a coincidence. It was a sign, just like the old man had warned them. And now they understood what it meant. They weren't just visitors in Mill Creek anymore. They had walked into the very heart of the curse, and there was no turning back. The legend was real. The blood-red sky wasn't just a color. It was a warning, and the real terror was just beginning. That evening, as the sun began to set, the sky transformed in a way the group had never seen before. The red hue that had lingered in the air deepened, becoming almost surreal, like an artist's brushstroke of ominous crimson across the heavens. It wasn't just the sunset. The entire sky seemed to pulse with a dark, foreboding energy, as if the clouds themselves were bleeding into the land. The wind had died down, and an eerie calm settled over the fields. The kind of silence that made the air feel thick and heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The group of friends sat around the campfire near the barn, the warmth of the flames offering little comfort against the oppressive mood that had overtaken them. They had been debating for hours whether they should leave Mill Creek and head back to the city, or stay just one more night. The unease they had felt from the very moment they arrived had only deepened as the day wore on. The things they had read in the library. The warnings from the locals. It was all beginning to feel too real. But none of them spoke of leaving aloud, not yet. The adventure, the thrill of the unknown, was still calling them. They had come for a story, for a bit of fear to spice up their lives. But now, the reality of the situation was settling in, and none of them could deny the sense of dread that had sunk deep into their bones.
As they sat in silence, staring into the flames, a rustling sound came from the field again. It was faint at first, a whisper of movement in the tall, dry grass. The group fell quiet, their eyes automatically turning toward the sound. They had heard it last night, but they had dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps an animal moving through the brush. But tonight was different. The sound was louder, sharper. It came from somewhere deeper in the field, closer than before, almost as if something or someone was moving deliberately through the tall grasses. The group exchanged uneasy glances, all of them feeling the weight of the sound pressing on their nerves. Dave, the most skeptical of the group, the one who had been dismissing all the rumors and stories, stood up. He brushed off the nervous tension that had settled in the air and walked toward the edge of the field where the sound was coming from. "It's probably just a deer or something," he called back to the group over his shoulder, his voice forced with bravado. But there was an edge of uncertainty to it. "Be careful," one of them called, but Dave waved them off, brushing aside their concern with a half smile. He moved farther into the field, his footsteps slow and calculated as he tried to peer into the growing darkness. The wind had completely stopped now, leaving an uncomfortable silence in its wake. The stillness was suffocating, and for a moment, the group felt as if the air itself had thickened, pressing down on them. Then, the sound stopped. For a brief moment, there was nothing but the pounding of their hearts in the quiet. No wind, no rustling, not even the chirp of a cricket. Just the sound of their own breathing, shallow and quick. They watched Dave, his figure slowly becoming more distant as he ventured deeper into the shadows. As Dave walked further away, the others stayed in place, staring into the darkening field, unable to look away. It was like their bodies were frozen in place, the tension building with every passing second. They couldn't explain it, but something about the scene, about the night, made them feel like they were no longer in control of their surroundings. They were intruders in a place that was not theirs, and the land knew it. It started as a shape, tall, dark, and unnatural, standing still at the far end of the field, just beyond the trees. At first, they thought it might be Dave, but it was too tall, too out of place. And it wasn't moving like a person. It was standing there, unmoving, as if it had been waiting
for them to notice it. The air around them grew thick. The wind had returned, but it wasn't like the breeze they were used to. This wind was cold, biting, and carried with it the unmistakable feeling of something wrong, something evil. It seemed to howl through the field, like it was alive, trying to warn them. But the figure remained unmoving, a shadow against the darkening sky. "Dave!" one of the friends shouted, their voice breaking through the tense silence. But the word seemed to get lost in the air, swallowed by the oppressive weight that hung over the field. There was no response. Dave didn't turn. The figure in the distance didn't move. "Dave, come back," they called again. But this time, their voices seemed to fade, like their words were being sucked into the vast emptiness of the field. They stood up, trying to make sense of what was happening. Fear was crawling up their spines, creeping like a slow burn. They didn't know what they were looking at, but they knew they didn't want to find out. The figure in the distance moved. It wasn't fast, but it wasn't slow either. It took a deliberate step forward, its shadow stretching across the field, growing longer and more twisted as the red glow of the sky bathed the land in an eerie light. The figure seemed to glide, its shape too tall, too distorted to be human. And when it took another step, the ground seemed to tremble slightly beneath their feet. The air felt heavier, charged with a sense of dread that sank into their bones. Dave turned around at that moment, and they saw the fear in his eyes. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He turned, stumbling, and ran back toward the group as fast as he could, his footsteps desperate and frantic. "Dave!" they shouted, relief flooding through them as he neared. But before Dave could reach the safety of the campfire, before he could escape the field, the shadow moved faster than they could have imagined. It stretched its long, pale hand into the air, as if reaching for him, and in one smooth motion, it grabbed Dave. It wasn't a scream that filled the air, not at first. It was a sharp, sudden silence, as if the world itself had stopped. The figure pulled Dave into the shadows, vanishing into the darkness without a sound. It was so quick, so seamless, that none of them had time to react. They were frozen, their eyes wide in disbelief, unable to move or scream. The fire flickered, the flame dancing in the night air, casting long, twisted shadows across their faces. But the night was silent again. The kind of silence that felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Dave was gone. There was no scream. There was no struggle. They rushed forward, stumbling through the field, their hearts pounding, but there was nothing. No sign of Dave. No sign of anything but the empty field and the dark, distant trees. The shadows seemed to stretch on forever, swallowing up the light from the fire, leaving nothing but a suffocating dark void in its place. Fear gripped them all as they realized what had just happened. The thing in the field, it wasn't a ghost.
It wasn't a person. It was something else, something much worse. And it had taken Dave without a sound, without leaving a trace. The night stretched on, colder and darker than ever before. As they stood there in shock, trying to process the unthinkable, the wind picked up again, this time colder than before. The rustling came back, only it wasn't coming from the field anymore. It was coming from all around them, from the trees, the barn, the very air they breathed. And then, in the distance, they heard a sound, a low, guttural growl, coming from deep within the forest. It wasn't a man. It wasn't an animal. It was the sound of something ancient, something evil calling to them from the darkness. The group's heartbeats were deafening as they ran through the field, the thick, cold night air biting at their skin. Their legs were shaky, their breaths ragged as they pushed forward, trying to escape the terror that had descended upon them. The shadows of the field seemed to move, closing in around them with every step, and just beyond the trees, they could feel it, the presence, stalking them, following them, moving in unnatural silence. It wasn't just the rustling of wind or the chirping of insects. It was something alive, something aware of them, something that wanted them. Their footsteps were clumsy, desperate, as they scrambled toward the old farmhouse, their eyes wide, scanning the trees behind them. There was no sign of the shadowy figure now, no trace of Dave, but the fear lingered, heavy, suffocating, thick like smoke in their lungs. They had to get out. They had to escape. When they finally reached the farmhouse, they didn't waste a second. Without even thinking, they reached for the old trapdoor near the barn and yanked it open. The smell of damp earth and decay hit them immediately, filling their noses with a sharp, musty scent that seemed to choke the air. It was cool down there, the temperature dropping suddenly as they descended into the dark. It was a relief, in a way, to be away from the open field, away from the terrifying thing that had stolen Dave. But even as they stepped into the dark tunnel beneath the farmhouse, they couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. A tunnel was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for them to walk side by side. The walls were made of rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture, and the floor was uneven, making every step feel uncertain. The light from the trapdoor above flickered and soon vanished completely as they ventured deeper into the maze-like tunnels. They felt their way along the walls, hands brushing against the cold stone as they moved forward, the darkness wrapping around them like a suffocating cloak. At first, they thought they were safe. The air down here was cool. The oppressive weight of the field above them finally left behind. But the deeper they went, the more it felt like something was wrong. The very earth beneath them seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, breathing with a slow, steady rhythm.
The walls were too close, too tight. They couldn't see where the tunnel ended, and the further they went, the heavier the silence became.
Then one of them, their friend Lisa, suddenly stopped in her tracks, her hand pressing against the cold stone of the wall. She wasn't moving, her face pale as she stared ahead, eyes wide in disbelief. The others, who had been too focused on finding a way out, turned to see what had caught her attention.
And then they saw it.
The walls of the tunnel, once smooth and unremarkable, were now covered in strange markings, symbols that none of them recognized, but that they immediately recognized from the book they had read earlier. They were the same symbols they had seen carved into the barn, the same symbols that had haunted their thoughts since they first arrived. These weren't just scratches on the stone either. They were carvings, deep and deliberate, etched into the walls like something ancient. The symbols glowed faintly in the darkness, like they were alive, as if the stone itself was pulsing with a hidden energy. The air around them felt thick and charged, as if the very room was holding its breath. The group stared at the symbols, their minds racing with fear and confusion.
What were they? Why were they here?
The answers they had been searching for were now painfully close, but they couldn't make sense of any of it. The feeling of dread that had clung to them since their arrival intensified, seeping deeper into their bones. It was like they were walking through a forgotten place, a place where the past had been buried so deeply that it was now clawing its way back to the surface. One of them, Mark, the most level-headed of the group, stepped closer to the carvings, his hand reaching out cautiously. "What is this?" he whispered, as though speaking too loudly would break the fragile silence that had settled over them. But as his fingers brushed the wall, something happened. The ground beneath their feet trembled. It wasn't a gentle shake or the soft rumble of distant thunder. It was something far worse. It was as if the earth itself was alive, shifting beneath them, trying to wake from some long, forgotten slumber. The walls seemed to close in around them, the tunnel narrowing in a way that made it hard to breathe. The air thickened, pressing down on them, as if they were being suffocated by the very space they stood in. The markings on the walls flickered, their glow intensifying, becoming almost blinding in the sudden, oppressive darkness. The group froze. Their hearts raced, pounding in their chests as the tremors grew stronger, shaking the ground beneath them with an intensity that made their legs feel like jelly. And then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The tremors ceased, but the air remained heavy, thick with something unseen. They were all breathing heavily now, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. And then they saw it. At the far end of the tunnel, in the deepest shadows, something moved, slowly, deliberate, a shape, tall, unmistakable. It was standing still, watching them. For a moment, none of them could speak. They couldn't even breathe. But then it moved. It wasn't human. It didn't move like a person. It was fluid,
unnatural, and when it stepped forward, the shadows seemed to cling to it, wrapping around its form like a living cloak. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and the closer it came, the more they realized it wasn't just a person at all. It was something else, something ancient, something that had no business being here.
The air grew colder as the figure moved toward them, its presence like a dark cloud that consumed everything in its path. The symbols on the walls grew brighter, more vivid, as if reacting to the figure's approach. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate with a low, unsettling hum. It was a sound that came from deep within the earth, like something was stirring beneath them, awakening after a long, dark sleep. And then in the center of the tunnel, they found it. A large stone altar stood in the middle of the room. It was massive, carved from the same stone that made up the walls of the tunnel. Bloodstains covered its surface, dried and dark, as though the altar had seen too many horrors. The stains seemed to have soaked into the stone itself, becoming one with it. The group stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure in the shadows loomed closer, its presence growing more intense with every second. The earth beneath them seemed to tremble again, and they realized with sudden horror that this was no longer just a cursed land. It was something worse. The land was alive, but it wasn't just the land. It was the thing that had called them here. The thing that had been waiting. The air became thick with a dark, malevolent energy, and the ground beneath their feet rumbled again. They were trapped in a place that had been waiting for them, a place where the past had never truly died and the curse had never been broken. They realized then that they weren't just dealing with a ghost or a curse or even a forgotten legend. They were standing in the presence of something ancient, something much older and far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The earth, the stones, the very air, they were alive with a force that had been waiting for them to arrive. And now, there was no way out. Panic set in quickly as the realization hit them all at once. There was no escape. The tunnels, narrow and winding, seemed to close in on them, pressing down from every side. They had been running for what felt like hours, but now they knew it was all in vain. The only way out was blocked, and it wasn't by a collapsed wall or an old rusted door. No, it was by the very thing that had been chasing them. The figure, the shadow, the malevolent presence that had stolen Dave from them without a sound. The air in the tunnels thickened, heavy and suffocating, like it was alive with a power they could not understand. The walls, once silent, began to hum with low, guttural whispers that seemed to rise from deep within the earth. They weren't sure where the voices were coming from, whether it was the tunnel itself or something more sinister buried deep beneath their feet. The whispers seemed to creep into their minds, twisting their thoughts,
making everything feel foreign, unreal. Their hearts raced in their chests as the realization set in. The land itself, the earth, the cursed soil they stood on, was alive, and it was pulling them closer to something terrible.
The light from the small, flickering torch they carried cast long, shaking shadows on the walls as the group stumbled backward, trying to retreat. But there was no retreating, no place to run. The passageways of the tunnel stretched endlessly before them, yet somehow they all felt as though they were closing in, narrowing around them until there was nowhere left to go. The sky above them, visible through the cracks in the stone ceiling, had darkened from the unsettling shade of red to a pitch-black void, as if the world above had been swallowed by darkness. The moon, once a distant silvery orb, now hung like a sickle in the sky, casting a dim, sickly light that made everything beneath it appear distorted and unreal. The wind had died down, and the air felt still, thick with a malevolence that pressed against them like a heavy. One by one, they turned, faces pale with terror, toward the shadows that had followed them down into the earth. The shape that stood before them was no longer distant, no longer a fleeting figure in the dark. It was here, in the center of their world, blocking their path, standing tall and still, its form completely indistinct, but somehow wrong. Every instinct in their bodies screamed to run, but their legs refused to move, frozen by a force they didn't understand. The figure towered above them, its presence bending the very air around it. It was more than just a shadow. It was something ancient, something that had been waiting, something that had been born of the land itself. The darkness clung to it like a second skin, and the faintest glow seemed to radiate from its edges, but not a glow of light. It was the kind of glow that sucked in all light, swallowed it whole, leaving only darkness in its wake. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were hollow, empty voids that seemed to draw the light from the world, leaving nothing but the infinite blackness. And then it spoke. Or rather, it didn't speak in the way any living creature should. The voice wasn't something that came from its mouth. No, it was deeper, something that vibrated through the air, through their very bones. It was as if the earth itself was speaking to them, its voice low. "There is no escape," the voice echoed, a deep, hollow sound that seemed to seep into their thoughts, pushing past the barriers of their consciousness. "You are already part of it now. There is no way out." The words sent a chill through them, each syllable like ice scraping against their skin. The air around them seemed to shift as if the very tunnel was alive, breathing, expanding, contracting with each word
The figure spoke. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble violently. A low rumble starting deep within the earth, vibrating through the stone floor. The walls seemed to move, undulating, as if the very stones were alive with something ancient, something far older than any of them could comprehend. The shadows, which had been mere shapes before, began to stretch. They twisted and warped, reaching out toward the group, curling around them like serpents, pulling them closer to the center of the room. The figures in the shadows seemed to take shape, forming into twisted, grotesque silhouettes of what could only be described as nightmares. Faces, eyes, hands, parts of beings that were no longer human, emerged from the blackness, their forms clawing their way toward the group. The air grew thick with a terrible pressure. It was as though the land itself was alive, suffocating them, pressing in from all sides.
They had thought the figure,
The phantom, was just a ghost, something from the past, something that could be explained. But now, they understood. They weren't just dealing with a ghost. They weren't even dealing with a curse, at least not in the way they had thought. The land was alive. The soil, the earth beneath their feet, and it had been waiting for them, waiting for anyone foolish enough to wander in. The curse had never ended. It had only been waiting for someone to stumble into it, to awaken it. The figure that had been stalking them wasn't a spirit. It wasn't even a ghost. It was something far worse. Something ancient and powerful. A being born from the very land they had dared to trespass on. It wasn't bound by the rules of the living or the dead. It was something primal, something older than any of them could understand. And now they were trapped, caught in the grip of something far beyond their control. In the center of the room, they could see it now, a large stone altar. It was not like anything they had seen before. It was massive, dark, and ancient, worn smooth by time, but stained with dark, dried blood that had soaked into the stone. The altar seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if it were alive, as if it had been feeding on something, feeding on the souls of those who had come before. The figure stepped forward, its presence growing, bending the air around them, crushing their spirits with its weight. They could feel it, the pull of the land, the pull of the curse, drawing them toward the altar. The shadows that had stretched out from the walls began to close in on them, swirling around their legs, pulling them toward the center. They could feel the weight of the figure's gaze, like it was studying them, knowing their fears, knowing their weaknesses. The air was thick, with a heavy, suffocating pressure, and the walls seemed to close in, like the earth itself was trying to swallow them whole. The whispers from the walls grew louder, more insistent. They were not whispers anymore. They were voices, low, guttural sounds, like the earth itself was speaking to them, filling their minds with images of things long forgotten, things best left undisturbed. In that final moment, they understood. The land had claimed them. The curse had never ended. It had only waited. The red sky, the blood-red hue that had lingered in the distance, had been a warning. It had always been a warning, a sign that they were too late. The terror beneath the blood-red sky had lived on, and now it had found them. The figure stepped closer, and with its movement, the world around them began to blur. The ground rumbled again, more violently this time. The darkness closed in from all sides, and the last thing they heard before the darkness consumed them was the voice of the earth itself whispering their fate. There is no escape. And then everything went dark. Years passed, but the story of the abandoned fields in Kansas never truly faded. It became just another tale whispered about in the darker corners of town, something to frighten the younger generation, a tale to keep them from wandering too far. The town of Mill Creek, the closest settlement to the fields, had long since distanced itself from the land. People moved on with their lives, business as usual, but the fear never quite left the air. The legend of the cursed fields, of the blood-red sky, and the phantom that haunted the land lingered like smoke, always present in the back of their minds.
The fields themselves stood as a quiet reminder of the horrors that had once taken place. But they were largely forgotten by all who had survived, except for those who had ventured too close, those who had heard the whispers or seen the shadows moving in the night. Most of the survivors of that horrific night, those few who managed to escape the clutches of the curse, left Mill Creek behind. They scattered to different towns, leaving behind the town and its dark history. Elders, those who remained, spoke in hushed tones about the night the fields had claimed so many. Some of them had witnessed it, but most would not speak of it. It had become a burden on them, one they carried silently, as if it was better to forget than to remember. And for a while, they did. Time had a way of dulling memories, making them hazy and distant. But as with all dark things, time didn't erase them completely. The curse was patient. It didn't forget. It waited. On certain nights, when the sky turned blood red again, something stirred. It began small, like a faint rustling in the fields, a murmur in the air. But those who were brave, or foolish, enough to venture near the edge of the fields, could feel it. The ground beneath their feet seemed to hum with an ancient energy, the air thick with something unnameable. There were whispers, too faint to make out at first, but if you listened closely, you could hear them. Voices, soft and distant, like the wind itself was trying to speak. They were the voices of those who had gone before, trapped forever beneath the earth, their souls bound to the cursed land,
never to escape.
It wasn't just the whispers that people noticed.
It was the figure, the tall, dark figure that stood at the edge of the field, its shape barely distinguishable from the shadows of the trees. The figure was always there, no matter the time of night, no matter the season. It didn't move, not in a way that could be seen. It was like it was waiting for someone, anyone, to come close enough. Some said it was the spirit of the phantom, the one that had stalked the land long ago, still searching for victims, still hungry for souls. Others whispered that it wasn't just one figure. It was many. The souls of the lost, the cursed, all gathered together in the darkness, watching and waiting for the next one to fall into their trap.
The town of Mill Creek, of course, avoided the fields. They knew better than to wander near that cursed land. No one went near it after sunset, not even out of curiosity. They had heard the stories, and they knew the price of trespassing. The fear of the land was passed down, generation after generation, as if it were a family heirloom. The blood-red sky, the whispers from the earth, the figure at the edge of the field, it was all a part of the curse that had never truly ended. It had only grown stronger with time. The story of the curse had become a warning, but warnings fade. And eventually, a new generation was born. One that hadn't been raised with the same fear, but they didn't take the warnings seriously. After all, it was just a ghost story, right? A thing of the past, something to laugh about at parties or around the campfire. But those who did wander near the fields, those who stood at the edge and dared to look, would find something different, something that didn't belong. It was always the same. A tall figure standing at the edge of the field, the blood-red sky overhead. The air would grow heavy, and the whispers would start, growing louder with every step. And then, just as they thought they were safe, just as they thought they had seen nothing but a figment of their imagination, the figure would move, slowly, deliberately, coming closer. Those who had the courage or the foolishness to stay too long never came back. The field would swallow them, just as it had done before. And for the lucky ones, the ones who hadn't ventured too close, they would only hear the whispers, feel the weight of the land pressing against them, as if it were still watching, still waiting. No one truly knew what happened to the missing, and over time, the disappearances became part of the legend. The town moved on, but the curse never did. It wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. It wasn't something that could be buried. The land had claimed too many lives, too many souls, and now it was waiting for the next. Every so often, someone would pass through Kansas on the wrong night, unaware of the legend or the purse that lay just beyond the fields. And when they did, they would see it. The figure, tall and dark, waiting beneath the blood-red sky, ready to claim the next victim.
They wouldn't hear it at first, the whispers that rose from the earth, the soft rustling in the trees. But if they stayed too long, they would, and then it would be too late.
It was said that on the rare nights when the sky burned red, the curse was at its peak. That was when the land was the most alive, when the figure moved in the shadows, when the whispers turned into voices that were too loud to ignore. On those nights, the boundary between the living and the dead seemed to blur. The curse that had never truly ended would come to life, seeking new souls to bind to the land forever. Some say that the land itself calls to those who are destined to fall under its spell. That the figure standing at the edge of the field is a beacon, a warning to those who wander too close. And if you're unlucky enough to pass through on the wrong night, you might find yourself drawn to the land, unable to resist the pull of the shadows, the whispers, the figure waiting for you.
The town of Mill Creek may have moved on, but the legend, the curse, will never fade. It waits, hidden in the fields, beneath the blood-red sky, waiting for the next fool to disturb the land. And when they do, the terror that has haunted the place for so long will rise again. It will never end. It never can. The curse is eternal, and it will never release its grip. It was supposed